I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we're looking today at something that is not good literature. Actually, it's not even literature,
at all. No.
It's
about literature.
It's about literature, but it's not literature. So
no.
What are we looking at today?
We are looking at a talk that Mao Zedong gave in Yan'an in 1942 on art. What's the purpose of art in a communist society?
Hang on, you just said a word, Yan'an and Mao. Can we explain those to the listener?
So if you're the
who
sort of
is
person,
Mao?
Yeah, if you don't
is
really
he important?
If you don't know who Mao Zedong is, you really need to get on Wikipedia and read something. It's funny, Lee, you and I were talking about this right before the podcast. The number of people that we run into in the U.S. who have no idea who he even was. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that's fascinating to me because it's troubling in a way. Because China is the largest country on the planet, and Mao Zedong was someone who changed and affected Chinese culture more deeply than anyone in the 20th century by a long shot. Mm. I would say by a long shot. You're shaking your head because you're contrarian, but
sure.
By nature,
no, that's not true.
You just like to contradict me.
That's not true.
Kind of true. We're arguing about the fact that you don't argue. I love it. Anyway, so Mao was one of the very first communist leaders in China when the party was formed in the early 1920s by Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao.
Quick correction. He wasn't really a leader in the
no,
party.
Not
he was
then.
At the party when it formed,
yes.
But he was like just passing through and happened to be there almost.
He wasn't in charge of anything in the beginning. He sort of rose to power as it moved on.
Yeah, Chen Duxiu was the leader.
And you know what's interesting is that some of those early socialist thinkers were way more interesting than Mao. Like Li Dazhao in particular was a fascinating writer. We'll have to talk about him at some point. Anyway, Mao comes into his own essentially when Chiang Kai-shek Chiang Kai-shek begins to crack down on the communists in the late 1920s. The White Terror is in 1927 when Chiang Kai-shek just essentially starts slaughtering thousands and thousands of communists. And in the several years that follow, the party sort of fragments into various local bases, and then even that goes down the drain. No, go ahead. And
we should point out, so a lot of my students are unclear on communism and the nature of communism. Marx is this 19th century economist / philosopher.
Know who Karl Marx is. If you're listening to this podcast, you have to know who that is.
Who came up with communism. But communism is not just we all sing Kumbaya and get along. Communism is a very specific theory. And Marx proposed that the proletariat, that is the factory workers,
the urban workers
are going to unite and recognize that they are all the same class and that their class consciousness will be stronger than national consciousness or whatever, and they were going to overthrow the people who were oppressing them.
Right.
And Mao, the way he gains control of the party, it's interesting. He gains control by rejecting what Marx said about peasants, which Marx thought peasants were just redneck hicks who had no ability to have a class consciousness.
Well, that and the important thing about the urban workers of proletariat is that they're participating in a system that robs them of the fruits of their creative work. And for Marx, creativity is a little like one of the laws of thermodynamics, where you can't destroy it or create it. It's just this mass of energy, and the more you take away, the more it builds up until finally the workers are like, yeah, we're going to do something about this. But the farmers,
they don't have that.
Who cares? Like no one, they're just kind of out on the fringes, right?
Mao takes power by proposing that the peasants should be the ones to lead the revolution. So he reorients the Communist Party in China from the proletariat to the peasants at a time where the Chinese Communist Party is in the middle of the woods. They're in a very rural area. They don't have access to factory workers, and the proletariat urban workforce. And so,
well, and even more importantly than that, China in the early 20th century did not have the kind of developed urban industrial workforce that, say, Germany and England did.
That's sort of true, but neither did Russia.
I guess it depends where you are in Russia.
Well, I mean, it depends on where you are in China. Shanghai actually had a very developed population of factory workers.
In any case, Mao begins propounding this sort of new interpretation of Marxism,
things.
So one of the things that sort of propels Mao to power, besides this reorientation of Marxist theory, is the Long March, 1934 to 35, which is one of the truly great physical endeavors of the 20th century. It's really, I mean, whatever you think of Mao afterwards, this is putting all your cards on the table, and he essentially flees southeastern China and hikes with basically anyone who will join him. Let's see, I forget the exact distance. All the way up, China. Yeah, like it's something like,
and this is actually
several thousand miles. I forget the exact.
This reorientation of the Communist Party is occurring during the Long March. It occurs at the Conference of Zunyi,
and I think we talked a little bit about this on a different podcast, but this, more than anything else, is what forms communist ideology for the decades to come. Not any particular writing, but this hardcore status. If you're a communist, you're willing to die for it, because they were,
and lots of people did. Even today, I would say this period is what most defines Chinese communism.
You're fighting against the odds. I think even the Communist Party in China now still tries to have this sort of like, we're the underdog. We're sort of fighting against the powers that be, etc.
No, it's not the bourgeoisie that they're fighting. It's the Americans, or the West or Western.
But there's
pollution.
always got to be There's always got to be a long march. There's always got to be this great endeavor that we all have to join together and do. So Mao and the party get to Yan'an in 35 and set up their base there. And this is one of the curious things about Mao's legacy, because in the years that follow, they really do a great work in the region. I mean, a lot of the farms there had been suffering. They introduced collective labor, and people ate better.
The region we're talking about is just north of Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. When I was in China in 2006, it was a 10-hour train ride north. I'm sure it's much less now. But this is the region of the Yellow River and the Loess Plains, where you have farms that are built into hillsides. Most people are in Yan'an are living in caves. Mm-hmm. Which offers great protection for Mao, because both the Japanese and the KMT, that is the Chinese Communist Party's enemy. You mentioned Chiang Kai-shek earlier. Chiang Kai-shek is leading the KMT. They're bombing the heck out of Yan'an, but it doesn't really matter because they're living in a cave. Yeah, but they have farms carved out of hillsides, and this is a very kind of backwards area at the time, and they're struggling with how to become a modern country here.
Yeah.
And that's part of what comes out of the Yan'an talks.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the Yan'an talks, 1942 to 44 is the Yan'an rectification movement.
And the talks themselves are done, Mao gives them in May of 1942.
And this is one of these other sort of mythical events, quasi-mythical events, where like people come from all over to join in this sort of great gathering of communist minds and everybody. And so Mao, because he's the guy, gives an opening talk on the role of art.
So lots of people are coming into Yan'an at this time, and there are lots of socialist or left-leaning writers who are coming in. But oftentimes those writers are independent thinkers, I'll say, and many of them come to what they expect to be a socialist paradise, and they actually find a lot of problems, and they write about those problems. And so that's the context for when Mao gives this speech. So I'm speaking specifically about Ding Ling. Ding Ling in March of 1942 published an essay called Thoughts on March 8, which heavily criticized the Communist Party in terms of a feminist perspective. Ding Ling, we've done Miss Sophie's Diary, and we're going to do some more on her.
Right.
She writes essentially that men are judged differently from women in Yan'an. Men are judged based off of their kind of ideological their ideological values, whereas women, their ideology is always determined by who they're sleeping with. And Ding Ling says, hey, that's a double standard, and you're not living up to that. So all of this criticism is coming at Mao, and then Mao gives this 2-day-long speech.
Right. And the speech, in its essence, is him saying, you know, all these people who are coming and writing Lord only knows what, they're missing the point. What does it mean to write in such a way that you're furthering the revolution, right? The communist revolution. And the way you do that is essentially not to just write about what you think about this or you think of that. You need to be writing for and about the masses, the people.
And Mao is always the one who gets to determine who is in the masses and who is not in the masses.
He does, and he gets to clarify this. It's the workers, the peasants, and the soldiers. Yeah. These are sort of the beating heart of the communist revolution.
Yeah.
And any writer who wants to call themselves a part of this revolution, they have to be not only just sort of observing these people, they have to live and breathe the same things these people are living and breathing.
They even have to use the same kind of language and stories that are coming from
There's a quote later, a bit later on in the talk, and he says, when he talks about people that are lacking in understanding, he says, what does lacking in understanding mean? Not understanding the language, that is, not being familiar with the rich, lively language of the masses. Since many writers and artists stand aloof from the masses and lead empty lives, naturally they are unfamiliar with the language of the people. Accordingly, their works are not only insipid in language, but often contain nondescript expressions of their own coining that run counter to popular usage. And this is way more interesting than it sounds, because if all he had said was, you know what, you people and people like you who aren't even at Yan'an, who are just sort of writing whatever you want, you're totally missing the boat. That would be one thing. But the specific charge he levels against them is that their writing is aesthetically lacking. It's not content. It's that the style, the language itself is, and I like the word that is used here in translation, insipid. It's bland. It's like lacking in flavor.
And what's so fascinating is that for me, and we've talked about this before, this propagandistic literature is actually the insipid thing. And when you read Mao's speech, it goes on, and at some points, he's just kind of like talking for the sake of talking. He's not really saying anything. He's just talking almost to make you listen to his words. They don't actually make any sense. They're just kind of boring, wandering, ideological buzzwords. But and so that charge specifically seemed to me to stand out and be like, hey, Mao, you actually are a really horrible writer.
Well, but see, this is the thing. This is why it is an interesting charge, because he's not using the same aesthetic standard that had always existed and saying that people actually hit that standard. He's saying that standard is not a standard. The real standard is this one over here. So the real standard is actually the way a peasant talks. That is artistic brilliance. The way Du Fu wrote, not artistic brilliance. That's something for, you know, rich people who go to a university to talk about. That's not where the real stuff is. Real beauty is sort of in the soil with the people.
Which is especially ironic because Mao was a librarian at Beijing University,
right.
the most prestigious university in China.
Right. But the reason for me this is such an important talk is, well, first of all, it's the program that sets the next several decades of aesthetic works.
You can even say that it's still setting the program for aesthetic works, because Xi Jinping has recently, in the past couple of years, he's referred to this talk. Mm-hmm. He said, okay, we need our artists to be producing things more like what Mao talked about, which is, it says so much about what's going on in China.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because although in no way, shape, or form am I going to hold this up as sort of a great piece of, you know, literature or even philosophy.
It's actually quite bad.
Well, but here's the thing, is Mao's the first person to say the ordinary people of China, the illiterate even, they have something to say. They have something to say that's not only interesting, it's actually beautiful if you know how to listen to it. And that is an interesting thing to say, because it's something that even here in the U.S. and the Academy we grapple with. This sort of like
we need to be inclusive, but then we're like so exclusive as an academy.
Well, but that, but also, so we teach Shakespeare, Proust, Du Fu, etc. Is that really? There's nothing else like something? High school kid who writes an interesting essay on his life, that's crap. Like there's an obvious aesthetic standard we hold to, and you and I have our favorite works. We just did a podcast on our 5 favorite works, and it's pretty clear the line we toe. But this is still an interesting suggestion because it's insisting that, it's not just the educated people that have something to say. The farmer who's just out plowing his field has something to say. And, you and I are going to be doing an interview soon with Eleanor Goodman, who is a translator of worker poetry in China. And it is pretty remarkable, some of the sophistication that is in this stuff that you would never have heard about otherwise.
And it's completely... the bias against it is oftentimes completely class-based.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guilty of it myself.
How can a construction worker write great poetry?
Which
right?
is, honestly, that is why I brought into it. I was like, we'll see. This is probably going to be kind of like, the artwork you put on your fridge that your kid does that actually looks like garbage, but you're like, oh, it's really cute that you did it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it actually is really interesting.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is that, and where this program for me breaks down, and this is going to be one of my final thoughts on the whole thing, is Mao assumes that by having something to say, the peasants, the workers, the soldiers, what they say is going to support more or less what he's doing, but that's not necessarily the case, because yes, they have something to say, but the ordinary people are not interested in Marx. They're interested in ghost stories and folk stories and gossip and stuff that you're not really supposed to be writing if you're a good communist, but it's what they're writing. They're way more familiar with, say, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and more in favor of that than anything Mao was talking about. So, and Lee and I talked about this beforehand, but Mao opens this speech out in saying, let's go learn from these people. Let's drink their water. Let's listen to their speech and let's put that into words. And then that starts to happen. And then, but these people really aren't hardcore communist warriors. They just kind of want to tell fun stories and they're not interested in the revolution.
For me, the takeaway that's so interesting is how this echoes historically. We talked a little bit about how Mao was responding to Ding Ling and Wang Shiwei and others who were criticizing him. This happens again and again throughout the history of the PRC. Under Mao, there is a period where Mao says, hey, we need more criticism, like we're getting too stuffy here in the Communist Party. Let's let the people, the masses, criticize us. And then he gets that criticism and he's like, actually, we need to clamp down on this criticism. On page 479 of the text that we're reading, he says the masses can't be criticized. And by the masses, he of course means himself as a representative of the masses, I would argue. And this happens again and again. We see it in the 100 Flowers campaign. Mao in 1955 says, hey, we're getting a little too stuffy. Let's hear what the people have to say. And then suddenly people start criticizing him, and he gets his feelings hurt. And so he initiates the anti-rightist campaign. And that leads to the Great Leap Forward. And then that gets out of hand when the world's, the largest starvation in history occurs. Something like 25 to 55 million people starve in China in a handful of years in the late 1950s. And Mao is pushed sort of out of power. And then the same thing happens again where there's a period of opening up, and then you have the Cultural Revolution. And so I think it's fascinating that the seeds of this dynamic that haunts Chinese communism, and really I would say all communism, can be seen in this speech. That's what I take away from it.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add to that is that a lot of this is, I think, rooted in the fact that he was himself a poet and does have some aesthetic preferences.
And he's not a bad poet.
He's not a bad poet. He's not a genius, but he's not bad. Yeah. And I think there's always this realization that if you let people just write what they want, they'll produce beautiful stuff. But on the other hand, it's not going to further the cause of the party. And then, of course, later Mao himself. So there's always this seesaw between, look, we need to produce great art. And then also on the other hand, well, yeah, but if great art is undermining the party, then maybe we shouldn't do that either. So, and that all of that, like you say, is in this talk.
I think that's a good place to end it.
Yep.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.